everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So today I would like to talk about an academic book that I finished reading a couple of weeks ago, but it was in the month of September, which is dedicated to reading university press books. Now for myself, I'm expanding that to include academic books, whether or not they're published by university presses, simply because most academic books that are published outside of the United States are published not with university presses. I know that in France there really isn't such a thing as university presses, so you have popular presses that have an academic imprint. So I'm trying to include that as well. But today's book in English, the English version is actually published by a university press. And that is The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller by Carlo Ginzburg. Carlo Ginzburg is an Italian scholar, and his work was translated into English by John and Anne Tedeschi, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 1992. Now, I read the work in a French translation because I am here in Geneva and the libraries are, for the most part, in French. There are English books, there are English films, there are also German and Italian books and films, but this one was translated into French from Italian for very obvious reasons. If they're going to choose to translate a book, it's going to be into French. Carlo Ginzburg is what is known as a microhistorian. So microhistories are histories that look at an individual or a small community, looks at the documents related to that individual, so maybe Inquisition documents, and from that tries to piece together a cultural history based on what we know about that individual or that community. So some microhistorians that I have mentioned on this channel before include Natalie Zemon Davis, who's famous for her book, The Return of Martin Guerre. I made a video all about that book, I will link it down below, as well as Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, and I made a video about his book on Montaillou, which was an Albigensian community, and I will also link that video down below. Carlo Ginzburg is another microhistorian, and this time he is looking at a Renaissance figure who was a peasant. His name was Manocchio. He was a miller. Unlike most peasants, he was also literate. So he was influenced both by oral culture, oral peasant culture, as well as written intellectual culture. Manocchio was burned at the stake for heresy, and we learn a little bit about his beliefs based on what he read and the testimonies he gave to the inquisitors. So Manocchio was known for being very outspoken in his opposition to the institutional church, making fun of Catholic beliefs, sacraments, and at this time, people who did that were often lumped together and labeled as Lutheran. But what we come to see is, of course, that there was a wide range of theological beliefs that weren't considered orthodox, and Manocchio would probably not be considered a Christian, actually. He was a materialist, and so basically what he believed was that the entire world was simply matter, and that all of creation kind of came out of this pre-existing matter. So he was not a believer in creation ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing, but that there was always something and creation came out of that, including God. So the way that he thought of God is that God was always a part of this material world, but he was actualized over a period of time. And so you have God who is less developed and then moving towards development over, I guess, centuries. I don't really know what the time scale is, but that was his view of creation. And that is what Carlo Ginzburg concludes by piecing together what he said to the Inquisitor, as well as the kinds of books that he read. This book really convinced me that I should read Sir John Mandeville's travels. So Sir John Mandeville was a 15th century travel writer, kind of like Marco Polo, except much more fantastic, outrageous. It seems like this work really influenced some quite nutty views of the world, because Manocchio cites it over and over again in defense of all kinds of really absurd things that we know today just don't exist, never have existed. But yeah, it made me really want to read Sir John Mandeville's travels. What Carlo Ginzburg attempts to do in The Cheese and the Worms is to show how someone like Manocchio, who was a peasant and influenced by oral culture, how that shaped the way that he read intellectual works written by people who were not influenced by oral culture. So he basically takes this oral lens to these written texts, so that he offers some really interesting interpretations to the books that were being published. We also get to see how Manocchio, this ordinary peasant, is able to respond to the intellectual upheavals of his day. He lived in northern Italy, and he was clearly influenced by just all of the schisms that were occurring in the 16th century. The reason why this work is called The Cheese and the Worms is that Manocchio compares the creation of the world out of a material pre-existent matter to worms just spontaneously coming out of cheese. There's this belief that cheese could produce worms. Just as if you know the story of Louis Pasteur, there was this belief that flies would just suddenly appear from cheese, from milk, I think, actually. Now, as you can imagine, microhistories do have a weakness, and every historical approach does. This one being that you're looking at one individual or a small community, so you don't have this large sample size, and also that there's quite a lot of speculation. And Ginzburg isn't afraid to admit that speculation is a part of this. He would argue that there really isn't this foolproof approach to history, but rather that you have all of these artifacts, these documents, and that it's the historian's job to try to piece together a narrative to explain the cultural history of whatever era. The strength of these microhistories is that we get to see what it was like for people who didn't have cultural capital. How did they respond to contemporary events? So peasants, heretics, women. I definitely think that if you're interested in learning about microhistory, Carlo Ginzburg is certainly someone to read alongside, like I said, Natalie Zeman-Davis and Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. There were times when I felt like I wasn't entirely convinced about some of the conclusions that Ginzburg came to about Manocchio. But it's really the tools and the approach that really interests me. My work entails some microhistory, as well as what kind of microhistorians work with, which is new historicism. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about Stephen Greenblatt, who wrote a book called Renaissance Self-Fashioning. And he is the one who coined the term new historicism. And so new historicism looks at intellectual history through literature. A lot of microhistorians use new historicism. They will use literary texts in order to try to understand intellectual history. But that is for another video. I just want to say, whenever I mention Stephen Greenblatt, there's this book called The Swerve. It won a lot of awards. Do not read it. I'll let you know why in the future. But today I just wanted to talk about Carlo Ginzburg's book and to recommend it to you and to give you a little bit of an introduction about microhistories. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.